Please just put your hands together and welcome your next speaker to the stage, Dr. Adam Rutherford. Thanks, Paul.
Hi, everyone. I think it's 10 years since I've been in this room talking to you people about different things. Now, I'm here as a replacement for my friend Fern Riddell, who unfortunately couldn't make it. She was going to talk about the real sex lives of the Victorians. I guarantee this talk is going to be much less fun than that would have been. So I'm a geneticist. I'm at University College London, where I teach the history of genetics and the history of evolutionary thought, and that includes the pernicious history of the birth of scientific racism and also the emergence of eugenics in the 19th century. And over the last few years, I've effectively become a sort of de facto historian of science, because what I do is I look at new emerging research and how it becomes politicized. And in the case of the birth of scientific racism and the birth of eugenics, the argument that I make, and I think it's pretty persuasive, is that these fields, biology itself as a discipline, and genetics, and psychology, and statistics as academic disciplines, emerge not in parallel with political ideologies, but in service of them. So scientific racism emerges in the service of European expansion and colonialization, and genetics and psychology and statistics emerge in service of the political ideology of eugenics. And it's a lot to do with the misuse of Mendel. We all learn about Mendel at school and the basic rules of inheritance, and I'll come to talk about him in just a minute. I just like using this picture because we only ever see Mendel on his own. There he is with a petunia flower, not actually a pea plant, which is what he used for his experiments. But look at the rest of his crew. Aren't they great? You never see friars together. I particularly like this guy here. You know, really styling it out. Okay, so there's the obligatory book plug. So a few years ago, I think I spoke about this book at this meeting, and I was looking at DNA as a historical source, as a means of interpreting the past. And out of that, because I talked about the history of genetics, I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the birth of scientific racism and its repercussions today, and then subsequently published this year, I wrote this book, which is about the birth of eugenics and its consequences today, its legacies today. And it really is a thread that runs through most of the most heinous crimes of the 20th century, and it's a thing that we don't talk about enough. And in fact, Christine Pagel's talk just a minute ago, which was absolutely brilliant, during the pandemic, do not resuscitate notes, DNR notes, were put on people with Down syndrome in hospitals. That is an effective way, model of eugenics of the past. Later today, Joy Zhang's going to be talking about CRISPR-edited babies in China. That is also part of the legacy of eugenics. And tomorrow, Tommy Shakespeare is going to be talking about ableism, and that also is a significant part of the history of eugenics. So this is a thread that runs through most of the 20th century and is one that we don't really talk about. And then why are we talking about it now? Well, the legacies persist to this day. Can you see that? It's quite pink. Well, that's ironically because he's quite orange. Yeah, I'm pleased with myself for that. There's the former president, Donald Trump, who often expressed views that were straight out of the eugenics playbook. He subscribes and multiple times talked about subscribing to the racehorse theory of selection for humans. If you can breed racehorses to be stronger and faster and whatever you need racehorses to be, then why can't you do the same for humans? Here he is saying, you have good genes. This is talking to a crowd in Minnesota, a state in America with significant Scandinavian ancestry, and the population is 80% white. You have good genes, you know that, right? You have good genes. A lot of it's about the genes. It's worth reading this out verbatim, just to really convey how meanderingly mad it is. The racehorse theory, you think we're so different, you have good genes in Minnesota. Okay, sure. And what about, you remember this guy? So Dominic Cummings also has expressed multiple times in his voluminous blogs ideas about eugenics and embryo selection for traits such as intelligence. Since 2014, when he first started writing about this, after he'd attended a conference at Google, where various people were talking about embryo selection and polygenic scoring, the genes involved in complex traits such as intelligence. That conference was organized by me. So I have some responsibility for this. And then, remember, when I put this in, I was thinking, I can't actually remember how many prime ministers ago this is. One of our previous prime ministers from the last 18 months or so, they're pictured with the writer and polemicist Toby Young, who in 2015 is also expounding ideas about the new eugenics, embryo selection or gene editing for intelligence as a positive thing that we should be doing. Now, I picked these three out of many, but these are examples of how these very, very clear eugenics thoughts are right at the center of governance in both the UK and in America, or at least in the government that isn't the current government, or that I don't really understand politics. Now, it's an old idea, right? It's an old idea. It gets given a new name in the 1880s, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but the idea that we can selectively breed people in order to improve the stock, the quality of people, is as old as culture itself. It's first described, I think, in Plato, in Republics, books 5 and 6, and Plato talks about gold standard men and gold standard women being mated together at marriage festivals in order to sustain the strata of populations in ancient Greece. That never came to pass, of course, that sort of utopian fantasy. And then there's references in Plutarch's writings about Sparta, that the Spartans, that ultra-militaristic, racialized state that they had, the first selection process for them would be to take deformed babies and simply throw them off the apothecary into a deposit. We don't know whether that ever happened or not, because it's only reported in Plutarch several hundred years after the Spartans. And the Spartans are often really venerated in the early eugenics movement for their racialized state, and continue to be venerated by certain classes of people in a way that I find really weird, because they did actually lose at the Hot Gates in the Battle of Thermopylae. And the Spartans then went on to become a literal circus act. So I'm puzzled why we spend so much time saying how great they were. This is a picture from the film 300, not from the historical record. Seneca the Younger talks about embryo selection, not embryo selection, what am I talking about? He talks about killing children in ancient Rome if they are deformed or if they are diseased, just as you would to a sheep, to stop it spreading to the rest of the flock. So this is an idea. The idea of reproductive control via infanticide or selective breeding is as old as culture itself. But it gets scientified. It gets a new fillip in the 19th century from this man, Francis Galton, who is the half-cousin of Charles Darwin. And Galton is already famous by this point. By the time that The Origin of Species is published in 1859, Galton is already a best-selling travel writer. He traveled into Africa and part of Eurasia and came back and wrote a travel book. And unlike the Mark Twain idea that if you travel, it widens your horizons and removes prejudices, Galton came back as an extreme white supremacist. And of course, we mustn't judge people by contemporary standards. That's one of the golden rules of history. However, we can contextualize their views by comparing them to people of their age. And to say he was a white supremacist is uncontroversial. He's a white supremacist with extreme views for his time. Not atypical, but they are white supremacist views, unlike his cousin Darwin and others who, whilst holding views which we now find uncomfortable, are very typical, and he spent a lifetime as an abolitionist. But there's Galton, and there he is with a definition, the 1907 definition of eugenics. It's important to note that the use of the word racial qualities doesn't really relate to the way we talk about race today as a social construction. It's more just types of people. Galton's legacy is immense. I'll talk mostly about his eugenics, but his intellectual legacy for us is incredible. He's the first person to invent the weather map, right? So every weather map you've ever seen, this is the evolutionary origin of it, designed by Galton. Published in the Times in 1875, it is a weather map for the day before. So, I mean, arguably of limited use. Because he was fundamentally interested in heredity, so how characteristics are passed from generation to generation, one of the outstanding questions of this era was, are fingerprints unique to people, or are they passed down through families? And Galton was heavily instrumental in demonstrating that they are unique, and as a result of his work on fingerprints become adopted as a forensic technique that we still use to this day. The one at the top is published in the journal Nature. This is a novel way to cut round cakes. Didn't really catch on. He also invented the dog whistle, which is, I think, ironic. That's true as well. Now, there's an interesting thing about Galton as well, which relates to my own personal history. So I was an undergraduate in the same department where I'm now a lecturer. And then, in 1994, it was the Galton Laboratory, because he founded the Eugenics Records Office as part of UCL in 1904, and with a large financial legacy, maintained through the 20th century his presence at UCL. So at UCL, we have this very, very strong connection with the history of eugenics. The first Galton professor was Carl Pearson, one of the greatest statisticians of all time. The second was Ronald Fisher, also one of the greatest statisticians of all time. And also the founders of evolutionary thought in the 20th century. The modern synthesis comes out of these labs. And again, their work in statistics is driven by wanting to implement eugenics policies. This is an interesting quote from him. Galton dedicates the rest of his life from about the 1860s, having observed that man is not, I'm using man in a 19th century term, humankind, is not immutable according to Darwinian models. Having observed that, he then takes this idea, just like the racehorse theory, or just like what the ancient eugenicists were saying, and said, well, if cattle can be bred, and if sheep can be bred, then why can't humans be bred as well? And he devoted the rest of his life trying to promote the ideas, the scientific, I think pseudoscientific, but the scientific ideas of eugenics, as well as it being pursued with a religious fervor. This was the enduring passion of his life. I put this slide up because I'd never really come across the word jihad until September the 11th, 2001, but there it is at the beginning of this century being used to describe how people should think about eugenics at this time. Now, the thing about eugenics is that it starts out off as a positive idea. Eugenics means, sort of roughly translates, it's Galton's coinage, it means good genes or well-born. Right? So good genes, just like Trump was saying about the racehorses. And it starts out as a desire to improve the quality of society. But of course, as soon as you start talking about ranking people, it means you have people on the top with qualities that are desirable and people below them that are undesirable. And who gets to decide what those qualities are? It's the hegemonic political leaders. And of course, if you're Galton or the upper or middle class white men in Victorian Britain, what happens very rapidly is you establish that this is the group of people we want to preserve. And who gets deselected as being undesirable includes, in every case where eugenics has been explored or expressed, racialized minorities, people with disabilities, people with specific medical diagnoses, so they're using the terminology of the time, Mongolism, now what we would describe as people with Down syndrome, people with sort of non-specific pseudo-psychiatric diagnoses such as feeble-mindedness, and then it becomes women with menstrual troubles, and it becomes alcoholics and epileptics and iterant criminals, right? So whatever eugenics is, it starts off as a positive idea by hegemonic power brokers, but it is fundamentally racist, classist, sexist, ableist. And there isn't a case where we discuss eugenics where this hasn't come to pass. What's fascinating about the eugenics movement, studying it in the sort of Victorian, Edwardian era, is how almost universally popular it is. An idea that we find so toxic today is supported across society, across political divides and across class divides as well. This is a couple of examples. This is an advert from the Underground from 1907, check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. This one here from 1910 is a Valentine's card, a eugenics Valentine's card. And they say romance is dead. Now, when I show this slide to my students or to audiences, I offer them a free book if anyone can name all 5 people on this slide. And it's only ever happened once. If you can do it, put your hand up, but you have to name all 5. But the point of this slide is to demonstrate that it's often associated, eugenics is often associated with right-wing ideologies. It's assumed that this is a right-wing practice. But in fact, that's just not true. It was embraced by the socialist left and the right equivalently. Anyone? Okay, no free books for you. That's Beatrice and Sidney Webb, so the founders of the Fabian Society, so people involved in the establishment of the welfare state and ultimately the NHS. Also, William Beveridge was heavily invested in eugenics as well. That's George Bernard Shaw, so a cultural icon. On the bottom, Churchill, a young Churchill here. Here at this time in 1912, he's the Home Secretary in the Asquith government. And this guy, Arthur Balfour. So we've got a future prime minister here and a former prime minister here. And these are some of many, many people who were the enthusiastic political and cultural supporters of eugenics. It's also very closely associated with first wave feminism as well. You probably know of Mary Stopes as the name adorning many, many thousands of clinics around the world that provide abortions and reproductive health advice for tens of thousands of women. A good thing, in my opinion. Mary Stopes' interest in reproductive rights of women is because she was a Nazi. And I don't mean that in a sort of, that guy's a Nazi. She was a literal Nazi. In 1938, she wrote a book of love poetry, which included verses such as Catholics, Prussians, the Jews, and the Russians are all a curse, or something worse. And she wrote this and sent it to Adolf Hitler. So this is 38. This is right up against the beginning of the war, at a point where I think most of us knew that he was a bad guy. Same in the States with Margaret Sanger, who went on to effectively found Planned Parenthood and Title IX and Title X. Churchill is the main political driver in this period of the eugenics movement. He's become inspired by what's happening in America. They were a bit ahead of us, and I'll come to that in just a minute, in terms of getting enforced sterilization onto the legislation books. The first was in 1907 in Indiana. And so Churchill brings those ideas to Parliament and multiple attempts to bring legislation which is enforced sterilization into the UK. And here he is proposing in 1912 and what becomes the Mental Deficiencies Act. It passes Parliament and becomes law in 1913. And the early drafts, which were written by Churchill, it includes enforced sterilization. But through the filibustering and campaigning mostly of Josiah Wedgwood, another member of the Darwin clan, who recognized that, well, this quote at the top is absolutely amazing and should be a sort of mantra for our time. Legislation for the sake of a scientific creed in which in 10 years' time will be discredited, which is absolutely what happened. So we never actually had codified eugenics in this country, having been the nursery, the birthplace of this pernicious idea. We never actually put it on our statute books. Now, that is not what happened in the rest of the world. We very successfully exported the idea around the rest of the world. 31 countries over the course of the 20th century had eugenics and forced sterilization on their statute book. So it becomes a global phenomenon, even though in the UK we escaped that by just a whisper. I'll skip across to America, because other than Nazi Germany, America is the country that embraces eugenics and enforced sterilization more than any other on earth. Here's an example of a letter from Teddy Roosevelt to Charles Davenport, more on Davenport in a minute, but here, it's this moral crusade, that religious jihad, the fervor that Galton inspired in people, that this is the right thing to do, and it's the moral responsibility of people to leave good blood behind them rather than perpetuating citizens of the wrong type. Now, remember these guys from 2017 chanting, "The Jews will not replace us"? Well, the situation in America is slightly different at this point to in the UK. Both are undergoing sort of industrial revolutions, or the wake of the industrial revolutions, urbanization and expanding visible poor class, the movement of the responsibility for the poorest and socioeconomically deprived members of society from the church to the state. But in America, there's a different, or a clearer expression of a different problem, which is the defining issue of this time is immigration. Right? In the years 1900 to 1915, 15 million new American citizens come, mostly from Russia, Poland, Ireland, and Italy. And this is the sort of defining idea, but with it comes a refreshment of an old idea, which becomes codified as Great Replacement theory. The idea that the decadent middle classes are not having enough children and are losing their grip on power because the working classes or immigrants or the descendants of the enslaved are more fertile, and they will swamp out the ruling parties, the ruling people, which in all cases is white, middle, and upper-class people. And this continues to be expressed into the 21st century here at the Unite the Right rally in 2017. There was an interesting follow-up to this now iconic picture, which is that none of the people in this picture can get employment now. Which I feel nothing about at all. Now, again, I just want to give a couple of examples of how part of culture this idea is, to the extent that it is part of our food and part of the way that we changed how we eat breakfast. John Harvey Kellogg invents the cornflake, along with his brother, William Kellogg, in the 1890s. Their motivation is different because John Harvey Kellogg is a super, super weird guy. He's absolutely obsessed with the preservation of the white race by stopping people's libidos, specifically preventing teenage white boys from masturbating. He was absolutely obsessed with wanking. And the cornflake for him was part of a set of foods that he invented or promoted, which were incredibly bland, because he believed that any flavor, sugar, salt, coffee, cinnamon, any flavor at all, would stimulate the libido of teenage boys, causing them to just leak their precious bodily fluid. I know this sounds funny, but it is absolutely true, this. And William Kellogg and him, they basically split apart, and William Kellogg ended up adding sugar to the otherwise horrible cornflakes and invented the Frosty. Right? I mean, I am super not into kink shaming, but this is a guy who was married for 30 years and boasted about never having had sex with his wife once, and he had a daily enema. I just think they're red flags, right? Anyway, so he made a lot of money, millions, from his anti-wanking breakfasts, that some of which you will have eaten this morning, so think about that tomorrow, and founded the Race Betterment Foundation, which was a eugenic and white purity establishment, and was very influential in developing the ideas of eugenics at this time. Now, who's read, in this room, who's read The Great Gatsby? Everyone, because it's the best novel ever written. Correct? See? Who noticed that white supremacy, great replacement theory, and eugenics is a central theme in The Great Gatsby? Yeah, none of you. No, one person there did. Well, I didn't. I read it first when I was a teenager, and I've read it dozens of times since, and I didn't really notice this until the last few years. But it's right there. It's right there in the first few pages. Tom Buchanan, the most grotesque character in this horror story, it very specifically cites great replacement theory in this quote here. If we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. And he's quoting a popular science book, a fictional popular science book, by a fictional scientist he calls Goddard. And the book is called The Rise of the Colored Empires. And it's actually based on this exact description, and that book is based on two books that came out in 1916 and 1920, The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant and The Rising Tide of Color by Lothrop Stoddard. Right? So The Rise of the Colored Empires by Goddard, The Rising Tide of Color by Lothrop Stoddard. So it's not very subtle. This is no coincidence that F. Scott Fitzgerald is writing about this, because all three books, Gatsby and these two, have the same editor. Right? Now, The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant is an absolutely mad book. It's extreme, it's meant to be nonfiction, but it's completely made up. It's extreme white supremacy, it's lamenting the demise of the white race in America, great replacement theory, but also comes with some really batty ideas about where the white race comes from and the dominance of white supremacy in history. He doesn't argue, he asserts that the empires of Greece and Rome and Egypt were actually Nordic in origin. So Nordic men came down from their woodland retreats in Scandinavia, seeded these populations, and then retreated back to their woodland retreats, having set up Greek civilizations. He takes skull measurements from statues of Dante and Michelangelo and Leonardo, and concludes, based on their skull measurements, that they're German. So it's completely, it's mad. It's super racist, super white supremacist, and it's utterly, utterly fiction. It's worth reading. Have a look at it, because it is really one of the most influential books of the 20th century. It was a massive bestseller. Madison Grant also writes the introduction to the Stoddard book right there. But during 1927, after the beer putsch in Berlin, when Hitler was arrested and spent some time in prison, he read The Passing of the Great Race, and it fundamentally inspired him. And he turns the word Nordic purity into Aryan purity. And when he takes power in 1933, the first book translated into German under the Third Reich is The Passing of the Great Race. So Madison Grant's influence on the global events of the 20th century is staggering. And there it is being referenced in The Great Gatsby. And that is no coincidence. I mentioned that they have the same editor, but what's happening here is that the Gilded Age philanthropists, the mega millionaires of this upstate New York mostly, but sort of East Coast millionaires from Standard Oil and from railroad tycoons, this is part of the conversation. This is part of the discourse for these people. As they're at their parties up in the Hamptons, they're troubled by immigration. And Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, his wife, they know a young woman whose name is Mary Harriman Rumsey. She's in her 20s, and she's so enthusiastic about eugenics that at her college in New York, her nickname was Eugenia. And Eugenia introduces her mother, who is Mary Harriman. So she's the richest woman in America at the time, the widow of E.H. Harriman, the railroad tycoon. Sorry, I love this bit of history, so I can get really nerdy about it. But she's the richest woman in America at the time, and the daughter, Eugenia, introduces her tutor, Charles Davenport, to her mother, and what happens as a result of that is that Mary Harriman, along with Carnegie and along with John Rockefeller, possibly the richest American to have ever lived, they fund the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor for the next 30 years, up until its demise in 1938. So it's part of the culture, it's part of these Gilded Age philanthropists, mega millionaires. Their anxieties about immigration are latched onto by this chap, Charles Davenport, who is the sort of Francis Galton of American eugenics. And I'm going to talk about these three white, awful, terrible men for the next few minutes. Davenport is on the left there, and I'll start with him because he comes to the UK in the late 1800s, the 1890s, and he meets Francis Galton. He's a biologist, but he's inspired to devote the rest of his life to promoting the ideas of eugenics. And he gets this money from the Harrimans and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and uses it to set up the Eugenics Records Office on Cold Spring Harbor. And you can see here, this isn't science, this is science applied to social issues. So it's always a political ideology. It's the co-opting of science into a pre-existing political ideology of white supremacy and great replacement fears. And what the Records Office was doing was very clever because they recognized that this looks like a top-down thing. It looks like a government thing. This is rich people telling working class people that they can and can't reproduce. So what they did is they trained mostly women, here at the top on the left, mostly women to go out to agricultural fairs in Iowa and Kansas and other rural communities. And at these agricultural fairs where they're comparing, cows, cow competitions. I don't know what a cow competition is. There's a quote by one of them which says, whilst you're comparing the Frisians with the Holsteins, you should also be comparing the Joneses with the Smiths. And that's what they did. So these women went out and with these long forms, 8-page forms, and they amassed as much family data from these families, these farming families in Kansas and Iowa, including their relationships, their any hereditary diseases or traits, and as much information as they could. And in return, they got a little trinket. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, that's exactly what 23andMe do, right? A bit of useless scientific information that you get in exchange. Well, actually, you pay for it, but what they're actually doing is harvesting the biggest data set that the universe has ever seen, which is your genome. That's just an aside. And then they took these records, the carbon-copied records, and they took them to the Records Office, because what they were actually trying to do in the Eugenics Records Office was establish a Mendelian pedigree for the whole of America. Because they believed that, Charles Davenport believed that every characteristic, every disease, every trait had a single genetic cause. That Mendelian genetics that we teach at school from his pea plants, he believed that every characteristic like feeble-mindedness or hair color or eye color, or all of those things, are caused by a single gene. And if we could map that on a family tree for the whole of America, we have a pivot on which you can leverage the future of eugenics and purify the nation, remove the undesirable and enhance the desirable. Now, back to Mendel. So that is the Mendelian idea. We learn this at school. We learn this idea about how units of inheritance are passed from generation to generation by specific laws, Mendelian inheritance. It is basically right. It's one of the few laws that we have in biology. But it is more like a set of guidelines because we are more complicated than peas. And Mendel kind of knew this, and most biologists today know this absolutely. There are very few purely Mendelian traits, but at the beginning of the 20th century, beginning of the 1900s, when Mendel's laws are translated into English for the first time, the people like Davenport really latch onto this idea because it allows them to say, well, this is how eugenics is going to work, because now we understand genetics. Now, how do we teach Mendelian biology at school? The first trait that we look at is eye color, right? Everyone knows this. Brown eyes, blue is recessive, brown is dominant. You have to have 2 copies of the blue-eyed gene in order to have blue eyes, right? Yeah, no, it's not true, okay, right? I don't think there's any GCSE students in this room, but if you're doing your GCSEs, put the answer in the textbook. But this is just not true, right? It's perfectly possible for any eye colors and parents to have any eye colors and children. Probabilistically, you're more likely to follow these Mendelian rules, but there are at least 15 genes that are heavily involved in eye color determination. And I'm telling you, as someone who spent 28 years being a geneticist, that I don't understand the genetics of eye color determination, right? So I'm guessing that you don't either. Right? But there it is. We teach it to GCSE. It's part of the exam. It's part of the curriculum. 1 gene encodes blue and brown eyes. Where does this idea come from? Charles Davenport. He publishes a paper in 1907 which describes this pattern of inheritance for eye color. It's a crap paper, right? There's plenty of good science from this time. I'm not saying that it's crap paper because it's old. It's a crap paper because it's scientifically illiterate. He identifies in his cohort people who have hazel eyes and then says, we suspect hazel eyes to be of the blue type. All right? It's bad science, but there it is as part of his eugenics ideology. The second one we use is hair color. I asked Hannah Fry, my friend and colleague, to provide me with a picture of her with ginger hair, and she gave me this picture. She has a big moustache in it. Everyone knows that ginger hair is also a recessive trait in the gene MC1R. At least 17 alleles have been identified that you have to have 2 copies of in order to have red hair, right? No. That's what we teach at school, but in the most recent studies from only the last couple of years with hundreds of thousands of people involved, what we've now determined is that the majority of people with 2 copies of a ginger allele for MC1R do not have ginger hair. We don't really understand the genetics of hair color. And I'll do the 28 years thing again. I've been studying this, and if I don't know that, I'm guessing that you don't either. All right? But we teach it as gospel. This is how we teach how genetics actually works. And where does it come from? Davenport. There it is again. He's the founder of this kind of mythology. A third one. So Huntington's disease. This is a picture of Woody Guthrie. He died of Huntington's in the 1960s. Huntington's is a disease which is caused by a single gene with almost 100% penetrance. And the pattern of inheritance is dominant. You have 1 copy of the gene, you will get Huntington's. And that description of how the inheritance pattern in America was written in a paper by Charles Davenport. Again, now he gets this one right, but when you read the abstract of that paper, he attributes the origin, the founding event for Huntington's in America to 3 immigrants who came 2 centuries before. This is unverified, we can't check up on it, but then again, it is the same narrative. This is a scientific idea which is being used to bolster a political ideology. Now, this is an idea which is so sticky. This is what we might refer to as monogenic determinism, the idea that there is 1 gene for a characteristic, and if you have that gene, that is how you will be. It's so sticky in our culture that I used to collect headlines from the newspapers when they report scientists discover the gene for X, where X is a complex trait. None of these things are true at all. It doesn't happen so much anymore because we've basically found most of the genes in the human genome. But look, in the Telegraph, a gene that makes you good at taking risky decisions. Sure. The happiness gene discovered in the middle row. From the male, gene that can scare you out of your mind, the gene that makes you politically left-wing, the gene that makes you unfaithful. And the weird thing about this is all these three are the same gene. Imagine having that as a phenotype. Permanently terrified left-wing shagger. But it's not just the right-wing press as well. Here's The Guardian saying the gene for cocaine addiction. This is from The Atlantic, a very august magazine from the States. A gene that predicts what time of day you will die. I have no idea how that works. This one is from Scientific American, another pillar of the science communication landscape, particularly in America. This is from 2016, schizophrenia gene discovered. Right. Schizophrenia is a disease which has a heritable component to it, because everything has a heritable component to it. Some of it's genetic, some of it's environmental. So far, in looking in genome-wide association studies, we found something like 150 genes that have a significant but small cumulative effect in the probability of developing schizophrenia. Right? And that accounts for a small proportion of the overall heritability. There is no schizophrenia gene at all. There is a genetic component to it because there is a genetic component to everything. That is the first rule of behavior genetics, right? So it's crazy that we're still, in some of our most august magazines, science communication magazines, we're talking about the schizophrenia gene. At least they had the good grace to put it in scare quotes. Now, I want to introduce you to Herbert Goddard, the third of my triumvirate. And Goddard's role in this story is not what he's best known for. He's best known for being the first person to translate the IQ test into American in 1908. So it was originally written in French by Simone and Binet. But that's not his role in this story. He was also interested in the Mendelian ideas of feeble-mindedness. So he ran a clinic, a reformatory in New Jersey. And in that, he was treating at the time a young woman called, an 8-year-old girl called Gregor Kallikak. Here she is. She lived until the 1970s and has a very significant role in the history of eugenics in America. But he described her as a standard-issued female, a standard-issue feeble-minded girl, the type that fills our reformatories. But he wanted to understand the ontogeny of that feeble-mindedness, and he figured that it was Mendelian, caused by a single gene. So what he did is he went back through her family tree and traced her family tree to try and see which branch of the family had this feeble-mindedness and how it flowed through the family. And he did that in a book in 1912 called The Kallikak Family, a study in feeble-mindedness. And this is the Mendelian pedigree that he comes up with the feeble-mindedness flowing through the family. But the story goes like this. It's more interesting than just this pedigree, because what he identifies is that the founder of this lineage is a returning war hero, Revolutionary War hero, called Martin Kallikak. And Martin Kallikak is married to a fine, upstanding Quaker woman. But on the way back from the war, he stops off in a bar and meets what he describes as an attractive but feeble-minded tavern girl. And he impregnates her, and then he never sees her again. And then he goes home to his Quakeress wife and establishes a family, and they have fine, upstanding citizens in this branch of the family. But the tavern girl also has a family, and this is filled with the worst types of people in society. Again, I'm using the vernacular of the time and of the book, filled with miscreants and degenerates. And this becomes the founding myth of American eugenics. This idea that Gregor Kallikak's genetic predisposition to feeble-mindedness is Mendelian, it runs through his family, and it comes from this lineage. And it becomes so standard that here's a textbook picture from 1955, right, to the mid-50s here. And here we've got Martin Kallikak on the right. He married a worthy Quakeress. Look at her hat. And she bore 7 upright, worthy children. From these 7 worthy children came hundreds of the highest types of human beings. This is an undergraduate textbook. He dallied on the left. He dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl. She bore a son known as Old Horror, who had 10 children. From Old Horror's 10 children came hundreds of the lowest types of human being. This is in a textbook, right? Now, I could explain to you why this concept is just so nonsensical. I've mentioned schizophrenia and how it's polygenic, and that the genetics of a polygenic disease or trait only accounts for a tiny proportion of its heritability. I could explain to you, as I sort of alluded to, that concepts like feeble-minded are very vague bucket diagnoses, and we don't really know what they meant by feeble-minded 100 years ago. I could explain all of those things, And none of it would matter, because the truth of the matter is that the tavern girl did not exist. The whole myth of eugenics, the founding myth of eugenics in America was based on a lie. So there was that family, but it was an entirely different, unrelated family descended from a man called John Wolvercott's, nothing to do with Martin Kallikak at all. And they did have plenty of socioeconomic problems and heritable diseases in their family, but they also had successful people in their family as well. There's lots of photos in the Kallikak book, and some of the kids in those photos, some of the people described as old horror in these pictures, have facial symptoms which are very, very reminiscent of fetal alcohol syndrome, right? Which is obviously not genetically modulated, but a socially influenced disease. So the founding myth of eugenics is based on this lie, this fraud based on the Kallikak family tree. Now, I'm going to for the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to go through the history of eugenics in Germany, because it's important. And the founding sort of father of eugenics, the Galton or Davenport of the German eugenics movement, is a guy called Alfred Ploetz, who starts off life as a socialist and then spends some time on a communal farm in Iowa. And he's so appalled at the low quality of people that he meets there that he devotes the rest of his life to Nordic purity and eugenics in Germany. This is in the Second Reich era. He sets up the first eugenics journal, 1904, before the British did, and he sets up the second eugenics sort of council in Germany. He comes up with the word that they use in Germany. They don't really use the word eugenics in Germany so much as Rassenhygiene, race hygiene, based on the principle that public hygiene protects the people, personal hygiene protects the individual, and race hygiene should protect the race. And he develops this idea over many years. In the first decade, he goes and meets Galton. He comes to London and comes to the first eugenics congress, which was held at Imperial in 1912, and builds up the momentum of Rassenhygiene, the euthanasia and eugenics programs that reached their full nadir in the Third Reich. Nordic purity is the sort of central idea here. So it's got some elements of great replacement theory, but mostly it's the protection of the greatest race, which are the Aryan people. In 1920, the concept of Lebensunwerte Lebens is introduced, lives unworthy of life, and that becomes a central pillar to the euthanasia policies of the Nazis. And in 1933, one of the first laws passed, Hitler takes power in February. By July, one of the first laws is passed, which is one of what becomes collectively known as the Nuremberg laws, but they are laws for the prevention of hereditary diseases. And this is passed in 1933, and it's the building blocks of what culminates in the Holocaust in 1945. But let's just flip back to America and just go to the middle character of these three. And this is Harry Laughlin. Harry Laughlin, another biologist, and he's the deputy at the ERO, the Eugenics Records Office. So he's second in command under Charles Davenport. And his job is to go out and spread the word, spread the ideology of eugenics in America. And by the 1920s, many states were beginning to adopt and force sterilization. But Laughlin noticed that they were doing this in a sort of ad hoc way, right? So the legal framework was being made up on the spot. So he wrote a boilerplate template, so a legal document where all you had to do is change some of the words, and that state would have eugenic sterilization on their books. And it was very successful. 31 states in America adopted eugenics on their statute books. And for the majority of the 20th century, the majority of American states have eugenics on their books. We estimate that something like 80,000 people were sterilized against their will or knowledge in the 20th century. And if you think this has gone away, when was the last time a woman was sterilized against her will or knowledge in America? Well, last year is my closest records, but yes, this is a current practice. Also, and I sometimes give a book away at this point, but I won't today because I've run out. Which state in America was the most enthusiastic adopter of eugenics, accounting for half of the total number of sterilizations in America? California, famously liberal state. Yeah, that's more than half, and that's where the most recent sterilizations occur. Anyway, Harry Laughlin's template And Harry Lauchlan's presence and Davenport's presence in this story is no coincidence, because in Germany, they are out there. They're actually in Berlin in the 1930s. In 1936, Lauchlan gets an honorary degree from one of the German universities. They're out there with their science. It's funded. The 2 eugenics offices in Berlin are funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So they're out there providing the financial and intellectual and scientific framework for the development of eugenics in Germany. And the first law, the first Nuremberg law, the eugenics law, is a translation of Harry Lauchlan's template. So it's almost impossible to undersell the significance of the American eugenics project into Nazi Germany. And indeed, Paul Brandt, who was Hitler's personal physician and responsible for a lot of the psychiatric programs of the Nazis, in the second Nuremberg trials, the doctors' trials after the war, he actually cites the influence of the Americans as inspiration. We were trying to emulate what the Americans had done so successfully. Now, last, the Germans were adept propagandists. Paul Brandt also notes in that Nuremberg trial that he thought that Hitler thought that the people, the public, wouldn't accept these laws unless they were at war. And indeed, one of the later Nuremberg laws becomes backdated to the beginning of the war. It's signed in October 1939, but it's backdated to the 1st of September when Germany invaded Poland. So the eugenics program is inherent to going to war for Hitler. So persuading the people that this is an idea that is worth getting on board with. They were adept propagandists, and cinema was a big part of that. 1935 is when Triumph of the Will comes out. But also a set of films, 7 films over the course of 35 to 37, the Nuremberg films, we call them. And they're short films, they run in front of the main feature, and they're there for the promotion of ideas about eugenics and euthanasia. And the most interesting one is Das Erbe, the inheritance. And what happens in Das Erbe is that this young woman here, she's a scientist, and she's looking at some stag beetles rutting, you know, in that Darwinian way, the struggle for existence. But she doesn't know what's going on, so she goes to her professor and says, "What's going on?" And he says, "Let me explain evolution to you." And he sits her down, and they watch a film. So we're watching a film of them watching a film. And the film contains stag beetles rutting, and it contains dogs hunting hares and pedigrees of dogs and cocks sparring with each other. And he says, this is the nature, this is how nature works, the struggle for existence. And she says, halfway through, she says, "I get it now. Nature has its own racist policies." And they all fall about laughing, because that's a great joke. Now, I'm going to show you a bit of the film. It's very dark. Is there a way of dropping the light so you can see this a bit?
Bei sämtlichen Vorfahren die gleich guten Eigenschaften. Guter Jäger,
okay,
Jäger,
so here he is showing a pedigree of some dogs. And pedigree dogs, if you've got a dog, I've got a whippet, you get a little form from the kennel club like
dann
this.
würde die
But see if you watch what happens now.
ausfallen. Ein bekanntes Beispiel für die schrecklichen Folgen unüberlegten Handelns ist die amerikanische Familie Kallikak. Die Nachkommen des Leutnants Kallikak aus einer Ehe mit einer
So
erbgesunden
there he is
Frau
describing
waren alle
the
gesund.
Kallikak family. And on the right-hand
Sie
side,
gelangten als außerordentlich
erbgesunde Frau,
tüchtige
which
Menschen
kind of means
in die
heritably
Höchststellungen der
healthy
Vereinigten
woman, is full of the best types of human beings.
Kallikak hatte aber noch ein
493 of them.
voreheliches Kind
But on the right-hand
mit einer
side,
geistesschwachen Frau.
erbkranke Frau, so a
aus
sort
dieser
of
Verbindung
hereditarily ill
entwickelte
person,
sich
woman.
eine
And
weit
there is
verbreitete
the Mendelian
Nachkommenschaft.
mark of feeble-mindedness as it runs through this
Die
family.
gesunden
And as a
Nachkommen
result,
sind
you have a
durch
family
weiße
filled
Kreise
with the
dargestellt.
worst types of human
Die
beings.
vielen Erbkranken,
And so he goes on like this, and then what follows is some shock images of people with disabilities in sanatoriums. And the proposal is that these are people who should be exterminated, and that is what happened. That is exactly what happened under the Nuremberg laws as a result of this type of thinking. Following on from this, there's a message from the Führer himself, Hitler, saying it is the responsibility of good citizens to prevent this being passed down from family to family. So there it is. There's your Saturday morning entertainment at QED. So I want to leave you with 2 quotes. So we are talking, and later today we'll be talking about ideas which have some of their roots in the eugenics movement. And we've moved away from this. We now think it is a toxic idea, but the legacy of this idea echoes into our present. And JBS Haldane was another fellow from UCL, who was an amazing science communicator, a brilliant writer. And not unproblematic as well, because he was a Soviet communist and continued to be a Stalinist well into the second half of the 20th century. But he was very opposed to eugenics for both moral and scientific reasons. And he was someone who helped me frame science as not being this apolitical, amoral project that we're engaged with. Anyone who thinks that data is neutral and that science is not political has not been paying attention for the last 500 years. And what he says in his book, Heredity and Politics, in 1938, in response to, specifically says this, in response to the American eugenics movement and what is beginning to happen, or what we're beginning to learn about what's happening in Nazi Germany, he says that I do not believe our present knowledge of human heredity justifies such steps. And I think this is a mantra for today as well as it was in 1938. But let me leave you with another quote, another version of this sort of idea that comes from the great man himself, and this should be tattooed on everyone's faces. It's Darwin who says that ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. Thank you.